Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to him, 'Father, give me the share of the property that belongs to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and travelled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed his pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But then he came to himself and he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he's got him back safe and sound.' And he became angry, and he refused to go in. And his father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, all these years I've been working for you like a slave, and I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you've never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him?' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The editors of most English translations of the Bible have titled Jesus' story here in Luke 15 as "The Lost Son," or "The Parable of the Prodigal Son." These titles focus our attention on the younger son's journey. But Jesus emphasized at the beginning that this story was a family tale, a story about a man with 2 sons. Now, we looked at the younger brother's story last week, but this week we'll discover that the real message of the parable isn't grasped until we recognize the lostness of the older one as well. Now, when the younger son returned and the party started, the older son was absent. Now, you'd imagine that on such an important occasion as this, surely the servants would have been sent out to find him. After all, they're sent out with invites for other people. So where was he? Why didn't he get the message? And why wasn't the older son, the older brother, why wasn't he eagerly anticipating his brother's return like his father had? I think the answer to all these questions is the same. He was too busy. Jesus said he was in the field. The older son was working. The management of his father's estate was a great responsibility and very, very time-consuming. And this is where Jesus' story reveals that the two brothers are mirror images of each other. One was away from home in a distant country pursuing dissolute living, and the other was away from home in the field pursuing righteous work. Both were far away from home. Both were distant from their father. The only difference is that the older son appeared to be devoted to his father because he was making himself busy doing his father's work. Now, the inability to differentiate between the two is where the problem exists. We're often reminded that the desires of this world can tempt us away from God. They can draw us away from his presence and the intimate relationship that he desires for us. We're warned about the dangers to our souls that lurk in the distant countries of immorality. But what we don't hear so much about are the more subtle, but equally deadly perils that can rot the souls of those who work tirelessly in the fields for the Lord. When we look more like the younger son, the younger brother, our sinfulness is shamed and condemned by religious communities. But when we look like the older brother, our sinfulness is likely to be celebrated and affirmed by religious communities. This is what makes it so spiritually dangerous, and precisely why Jesus told this story to a group of self-righteous religious leaders, the Pharisees. The sins of the pagans is obvious. It's the sin of the church we must be on guard against. Christian author and writer Dallas Willard said this. He said, "The greatest threat to intimacy with God is service for God." Now, that's not because it's wrong, but because we can easily mistake doing for God with being with God. The older son called one of the servants and asked about the music and the dancing. "Your brother's come home," the servant said, "and your father has killed the fatted calf because he's got him back safe and sound." When he heard this, the older son became angry and refused to go in. By refusing to go in, by staying outside and stewing in his own anger, the older brother appears to be a lot like the Old Testament prophet Jonah. In the Old Testament, Jonah refused to go to Nineveh as the Lord had commanded him, and when God was later merciful towards that city and didn't destroy it, it says there, it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. This is what Jonah then complains to God. "This is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you were a gracious God and merciful and slow in anger and abounding in steadfast love." Jonah then asks God to take his life, "for it is better for me to die than live." The prophet would rather die than live in a world where his enemies are forgiven by God. Sadly, this is a common quality amongst the self-righteous, and the easiest way to spot those who use religion to boost their own value is that they get mad at God's mercy. The self-righteous, you see, falsely believe that their elevation requires another's condemnation. And we see the same tendency at work in many contemporary cultural and political battles. Some Christians think that their righteousness demands the exclusion of another group's wrongness. It's not enough, they say, for Christians to be blessed. They want their enemies cursed. So when the Lord shows mercy towards the sinful, it's unfortunately perceived by the righteous as an attack on themselves. It's a diminishment of their religious superiority. You see, if God is loving towards that terrible person, group, country, you can fill in the blanks yourself, I'm sure you know what we're talking about, then maybe I'm not as special as I thought. Maybe our team, our side, our group isn't better than everyone else. But is it wrong to want justice? Don't people throughout scriptures cry out and demand justice against their enemies? Yes, but it all depends on why you want justice. Is it because you ache over the evil in this world and the hurt caused by it? Or do you just want justice because when the guilty are condemned, your own sense of importance rises? If you're unsure about your motives, then consider this question. If God forgave the person who hurt you the most and then threw them a party, would you join the celebration? Or would we do a Jonah, sit in the corner and huff next to the older brother? How many of you have played a game of chicken? I mean, a game of chicken is one of nerve, courage, and stupidity. Two people race towards each other on a collision course, and the first one to turn away and save both from disaster loses and is labelled a chicken. Did you play it as a child on bikes? I'm not even going to ask if you ever did it in a car. I don't want to know. But most of us have outgrown it. Well, at least the physical version of the game. But unfortunately, some adults seem to enjoy and still engage in games of emotional chicken. Two people set themselves up on a relational collision course, each refusing to change direction or give in to the other. The first one to flinch in the standoff relinquishes his or her power in the relationship. Now, I'm sure you'll agree this is incredibly childish and self-defeating, but it still happens. There are still some people who believe that refusing to surrender or compromise is a mark of resolve and strength. And they think that their happiness requires another person's misery. Now, I mention that because this is the game the older son is playing in this parable. He refuses to enter the house and join the party, celebrating the return of his younger brother. Instead, he has a pity party for himself, out in the field, waiting for his father to notice his absence. By standing his ground, the older son attempts to show the father the fierceness and intensity of his anger. For the son, it was a standoff. It was a battle of wills. But the father didn't play the game. Instead, Jesus says, the father came out and began to plead with him. Despite being the elder, despite being right, the father humbled himself and made the first move towards his arrogant son. Now, this behaviour shouldn't surprise us. I mean, after all, the father acted similarly with the younger son when he ran out to meet him and embrace him. For the father, preserving his reputation is not nearly as important as reaching his children. If the Gospels tell us anything, it's that our Lord is not afraid to appear weak. He's not preoccupied with what others think, with being taken seriously or being perceived as weak. In fact, It's precisely Christ's strength that allowed him to endure the shame heaped upon him by the world. So like him, we are not to be stubborn when wronged or expect the other person to change before we engage with them. Instead, we're called to copy God, to imitate him, to make the first move, to find the other person and offer reconciliation. The world says chicken is the person who bends and the strong person is the one who stands his ground. But in God's kingdom, it's exactly the opposite. Now, true to his character, and this is something we got hints of last week and something we'll explore more next week, when the father discovered that his eldest son was not at home, he went out to find him. There, the father begged his older son to come to the party, but the young man was furious. "Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you and I've never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property of prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him." Now, many people sympathise with the older son. His anger seems justified. I mean, why should the disobedient son get a party whilst the obedient one gets nothing? But listen carefully to what he says. Notice what the older son emphasises. "All these years I have served you. I never disobeyed your command." Notice that? The older son obeyed, and for his obedience, he expected a reward. In this way, he really is not that different from the younger son. Neither of them, not the older brother or the younger brother, was particularly interested in a relationship with the father. Instead, they're both focused on what they might get from the father. The younger son simply took what he desired, while the older son, being a more patient and self-disciplined person, worked for it. Now, their methods were night and day, but both sons desired the same thing. And sadly, in both cases, it wasn't their father. In other words, both sons are self-centered. One just happened to be selfish in a more socially acceptable way. Jesus told this story at a gathering of very devoted religious people who drew a great deal of significance from their obedience to God. Men who would have identified with the older son and his righteous indignation. Was Jesus saying there's something wrong with serving God? Of course not. The problem comes when we find our significance and worth in it. In this family tale, Jesus is not diminishing the older brother's service, just as he's not endorsing the younger brother's sin. Instead, he was showing that both sin and service can distract us from what really matters, a relationship with God. Now, the climax of this family tale occurs when the father finally speaks to one of his children directly. And it's what Jesus' audience would have been waiting for. They must have listened to the whole story and wondered, when are we going to find out why this Jewish father acted so strangely? So the older son had just delivered his angry justification. His argument is that he had always obeyed his father, served him faithfully, and therefore he deserved a party far more than his immoral younger brother. The older brother believed he'd been cheated. The older brother was indicting the father on a charge of being dishonourable, the worst possible accusation in a shame-based culture like ancient Judea. So how does the father respond? Well, surprisingly, the father never addresses the accusation. He doesn't defend himself, nor does he affirm the older son's years of faithful obedience. I think by ignoring these culturally important aspects of a story, Jesus was implicitly saying to his audience that their focus, like the older son on honour, obedience and rewards, was misplaced. Instead, Jesus cuts past these values, these cultural values, and he reveals what is central to the heart of God. Son, the Father says, you are always with me. By focusing on his relationship with the older son, the Father was saying, have I not been enough for you? Were you just working to receive a party or to earn your inheritance? Have you found no joy in being with me all these years? What brought the Father delight was not the older son's service, but simply his presence. More important than obedience, honour, or even wealth was having his son near him. Like the older son, we get distracted by a great many things and we seek our fulfillment in lesser joy. We want honour, acknowledgement, and sometimes we seek this by sacrificially working for Christ and his kingdom. And in our striving, we forget that our Heavenly Father desires not our sacrifices. He's focused on his children, and he longs for us to discover the joy that is found in a life with him, not merely a life for him. Jesus told this story about the lost sons to an audience of Pharisees, people who knew a lot about God. These very religious men had memorized the entire Hebrew Bible. But this religious training raised a vital question. If they knew so much about God, how were they still so lost? In many ways, we're like the Pharisees. If you're a Christian living in Northern Ireland or anywhere in reality in the Western world, then you have access to a lot of knowledge about God. After all, we're the richest, most resourced Christians who've ever lived. We've more Christian books, radio stations, movies, colleges, university conferences, churches, blogs, Bibles, music albums, merchandise, devotionals than we can possibly engage with. And with these resources come a lot of information about God, and much of it good. But like the Pharisees, despite all of our knowledge, many of us are still lost. How can it be? The 17th century French philosopher Pascal said, "We know the truth, not only through reason, but through the heart. The heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing." Filling our minds with the doctrines of God's truth is important, and too often it's ignored today. But we must not neglect the role of the heart in our life with God. It's often the heart that pulls our decisions like a tractor. The mind, with its logic and reason and sense, gets dragged behind like the trailer. We create rational arguments for our behaviours only after the heart has already decided on its course. So therefore we must guard our hearts to make sure they don't lead us astray. It's the heart far more than the reason where we must learn to commune with God. Jesus said the good person out of the good treasure of the heart produces good, and the evil person out of evil treasure produces evil, for it's out of an abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. In other words, simply possessing right knowledge is not enough. We shouldn't be impressed with a leader simply because what they teach is correct. It's the heart that reveals our treasure and whether it's good or evil. And on that sober note, it's time to stop again. I warned you last week that we might find ourselves looking a little bit more like the older brother than the younger one. But like I told you last week, the Father is always looking for us. He's always there. So come home. Join the party. And join us next week to experience the joy of the Father.